December in New York had a disoriented light, like a sad musical note quietly falling into a void. In a small Brooklyn apartment, Imani Brooks stared at the last photograph she had taken for a client, a middle-aged woman whose eyes seemed to have swallowed an entire winter into her heart. That frame wasn't just her work. It was also a silent farewell to an old chapter of her own life. She folded her camera and placed it on the table. A wave of exhaustion rose to her neck and shoulders. Since her breakup 3 years ago, Imani had lived as if she were only temporarily inhabiting her own life. The photos she took became colder, the lighting dimmer, the expressions void, as if her soul had been sealed beneath layers of color correction. And then, an email arrived. Subject line: a freelance photographer is needed. Urgent. Sender: Caleb Whitmore. Location: a small coastal town in Oregon she had never heard of. The content was just a few lines. Looking for a documentary-style photographer for 3 weeks. Prefer someone not afraid of silence. Meals and lodging provided. Fair compensation. Imani frowned. She quickly searched for Caleb, an author who had published 2 novels nearly a decade ago, then vanished from the publishing world. No scandal, no explanation, just a clean disappearance as if he had never existed. But his books, especially The Nameless June, had once made Imani cry on a rainy afternoon at age 24. Perhaps that's why she typed a simple reply: "I'll come." Oregon welcomed her with a stillness that made time itself feel suspended. The small town, Port Astoria, is nestled between windswept hills and pine forests. Imani stepped off the last bus of the day, dragging her suitcase across empty streets. The ocean here wasn't loud like in New York. It rolled silently, as if guarding a great secret. Caleb's house sat atop a rocky cliff by the sea, antique and weathered like something from a Gothic novel. Ivy-covered walls, faded roof tiles, and a wooden door marked by time's decay. Imani took a deep breath and knocked 3 times. The door opened after a few minutes. The man before her was tall, scruffy-bearded, gray-eyed, and wore a solemn look. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. "Imani Brooks?" "Yes." "You must be Caleb." He nodded. "Come in." The sea wind has no patience, no polite greetings, no lingering glances. Yet something in Caleb's voice made her heart go still, as if she had stepped into another world where things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The first evening passed in silence. Caleb showed her around a few rooms, a small library, and a kitchen scented with warm burnt wood. He didn't explain the purpose of the photography. He only said, "Take pictures of whatever you can't look away from." Imani walked the hallway, camera in hand. The walls were lined with old photographs, faded oil paintings, and scribbled notes in blue ink. For some reason, it all felt deeply personal, like stumbling into pages of an unopened journal. When she raised the camera and clicked the first shot, snow began to fall softly outside the window. Snowflakes landed on the rooftop, melting into the bitter air. And Imani realized she took a photo for the first time in years, not for money, but because something in her heart quietly stirred. Can you feel the layers of emotion woven into this story? If your heart has ever grown weary from love, if you believe that broken souls can still find each other beyond the barriers of time, keep following beyond the edge of the horizon. Don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel for the next part. Every follow-up is a gentle way to help Imani and Caleb continue their journey. The early morning wind in Port Astoria wasn't skin-piercing cold, but it carried the scent of salt and seaweed that made one feel like they were breathing with their memories. Imani woke at 6:12 a.m. No alarm needed. The steady sound of waves crashing against the rocks had roused her, as had the lingering curiosity from the night before. The small guest room Caleb had prepared for her was a modest but warm space. Beige hand-woven sheets, an aging wooden dresser, and a window opened to a blotchy, misty sky. Everything bore traces of time, not the kind that spoke of decay, but the kind that made one feel safe. It was as if everything had already happened here and nothing needed to be hidden. Imani sat up, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and padded into the hallway. The creaking of the wooden floor whispered something to her with every step. She didn't know why Caleb had invited a stranger, a photographer, to this town, but her intuition told her the reason wasn't just for pictures. The kitchen was still cold, no sign of Caleb. She opened the back door, and the first sight that struck her took her breath away. A sheer cliff face, beneath it dark sea, and a narrow wooden pier jutting out, suspended in midair like a sketch against the sky. Caleb stood there, hands in the pockets of his long coat, back straight and silent, like a pencil mark on white paper. Imani approached, her shoes brushing softly against the damp wood. Caleb didn't turn, but he spoke. "Not everyone dares to step out here a second time." She raised an eyebrow, voice light as mist. "I haven't stepped back since the first." Caleb's lips curved slightly, a mix of a smile and an admission. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the morning light revealed his face. Sharp lines, gray eyes holding a depth that made one hesitant to ask how many sleepless nights he had endured. He said, "I'm not good at explaining, but if you plan to capture this town, you should start with what people don't want to see." "Like you?" Imani asked, half joking, half serious. Caleb didn't react. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "This is a map. I've marked a few spots where people used to live and where things once happened, but now only echoes remain." Imani took it, her fingers grazing the paper. She didn't need to ask what he wanted. She understood. He needed someone who could see deeply, not just to observe, but to remember. She began her journey that very afternoon. The camera hangs from her neck, and the steps are light but determined. The places Caleb had marked led her to a string of small ruins, a greenhouse overtaken by wildflowers bursting through broken glass, a hair salon with fogged windows and an old price list written in white chalk, and a pinewood chapel with a collapsed door. Yet its rusted bell still chimed faintly when the wind passed through. Here, the past didn't live in history books. It breathed through the cracks in brick walls, in the bird song echoing from empty rooftops, in the eyes of an older man by the roadside, who gazed at her as if he had seen her long ago. Imani didn't take many photos. Only when something truly touched her. A slanted ray of light across a stone bench, a faded handprint in peeling paint, did she raise her camera. She lived by speed, flash, and packed schedules in New York. But in Port Astoria, everything seemed to be teaching her how to see again, bit by bit. By evening, when she returned home, Caleb sat in the library, flipping through a worn leather-bound book. A warm yellow lamp glowed. The air was thick and rich, like long-aged wine. "How was your first day?" he asked without looking up. Imani hung her coat, poured a cup of ginger tea, then sat across from him. Quieter than I expected, but also more real. Caleb looked up. She saw a sadness without a name in his eyes, as if he had carried it so long it had become part of his bloodstream. "Someone once told me," he said slowly, "that this place is like a silent pain. Everyone here carries a memory they don't want to share." "You too?" Imani blurted out. He remained silent for so long she thought she had overstepped, But then he nodded slightly, as if admitting it was not easy. Maybe I invited you here, he said, voice low and thin as the wind, because I wanted to know if someone who knows nothing about me or this town could see something I've missed. Imani tightened her fingers around the cup. She understood. Sometimes, people needed a stranger to hear what the familiar couldn't ask. Night fell over the cliffs like a thick velvet cloth. The wind slipped through the cracks in the doors and drifted into Imani's dreams, bringing with it vague images. A little girl standing in a pine forest, holding a doll with no eyes. A man sitting on the wooden pier, face turned away, back hunched as if bearing an entire winter. She woke at 3:17 a.m., unsure if it was the dream or something else that had quietly entered her heart, silent and profound like the whisper of the sea. And at that moment, Imani knew that this town, this house, and the man with the gray eyes would not just be a temporary job, but the beginning of something more, something that had yet to be named. Mornings in Port Astoria always came slowly. Light didn't rush in like it did in noisy cities. It crept through the mist, timid and hesitant, as if it was also learning to believe in a new day. Imani sat by the living room window, her coffee long gone cold. Yesterday's photographs were spread across the table, and in each frame was a part of the town's soul, real and fragile, as if it would all vanish when she closed her eyes. She never had the habit of reviewing photos immediately, but this time was different. Something in the eyes of the man sitting at the abandoned bus stop, or the streak of sunlight cutting through the broken roof of the hair salon, unsettled her. It wasn't beauty, a delicate disquiet, like a wrong note in a gentle symphony. Caleb walked into the room. He wore a gray sweater and carried 2 cups of hot tea. His eyes, usually like a sea shrouded in mist, today had a touch of amber, warmer or less guarded. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice light but reaching deep. Imani looked up and pointed at a photo. In the frame was an old poplar tree, tall and solitary, growing beside a small house near the cliff's edge. Hanging from a branch was a pale purple ribbon, faded but fluttering softly in the wind. "I'm not sure," she said, "but it feels like someone is trying to hold on to something, or refusing to let go." Caleb was silent. After a moment, he set the tea down, stood up, and gestured for her to follow. Without asking further, Imani put on her coat and stepped outside, where the morning fog lingered in every breath. The old wooden house stood at the end of a stone path, perched precariously on a slope facing the sea. It wasn't big or beautiful, but it had an air of invincibility, as if time had tried to hurt it and eventually given up. Caleb unlocked the door with a rusted key from his inner coat pocket. "The attic," he said. "I've never been up there." "Why not?" He didn't answer, just pushed open the creaky wooden door. The scent of damp wood and ash spilled out, along with a feeling that had no name. They stepped inside. Imani felt like she had entered someone's memory, where every object held a piece of its past. Up a narrow, rickety staircase, the attic lay at the end of the hallway. Caleb paused at the first step, his eyes suddenly distant. "The last woman who lived here was my mother," he said. "She never let anyone into that attic." Imani nodded softly, not rushing, not interrupting the silence he was guarding. Instead, she stepped ahead, each step careful, as if the floor might cry out if pressed too hard. The attic door opened unexpectedly easily, as if it had been waiting a long time to be opened. The space inside was dust-covered, but not decayed. A rocking chair sat by the window, a faded wool rug beneath it. On the table was a notebook, beside it an empty pen. Imani reached for it and began flipping through the pages. Slanted handwriting appeared, ink blurred but still legible. If you've found this, it means you've forgiven. Or at least, you want to understand. She looked up and caught Caleb's eyes watching from the doorway. He didn't step in. It was as if standing there was already a betrayal of a memory he wasn't ready to face. Imani kept reading. Each page was a slice of the soul of the woman who had lived alone in this house. Reflections on her first winter without her husband, on her son, who had grown distant over the years, and on the times she walked to the cliff's edge to touch the wind he once stood in. One passage caught in Imani's throat. Caleb didn't cry at his father's funeral, but that night, I heard him screaming into his pillow. I wanted to go in, but I couldn't lift my hand. I was wrong. I mourned one by losing the other. When she stepped out of the attic, Caleb was still there. His eyes weren't teary, but something in them had shattered, wordlessly. She wrote to you, Imani said softly. She always said she didn't know how to write, Caleb replied, his laugh light but parched. They sat together on the front steps. The fog had lifted, but the sun hadn't yet risen. Only the scent of pine and sea mingled in the air, gentle, as if this place had never known pain. Why did I agree to come here? Imani asked, her eyes staring into the distance. For work? Not exactly. I was tired of just capturing images. I wanted to understand them. Caleb didn't reply, but something began to crack in that silence, not between them, but within him. That night, as Imani reviewed the attic photos, she noticed something strange. In the rocking chair picture, a faint beam of light shone through the window, glittering like silver dust. It wasn't ordinary light, the kind she dreamed of as a child, when her mother told fairy tales and said, "What's left unsaid always lingers in the light." She set the camera down, smiling quietly. The story in Port Astoria was unfolding in layers. Not loud, not sensational, but so deep that only the heart could feel it. And she knew she had chosen the right place to begin again, not by forgetting the past, but by learning how to walk through it. Coastal Ember Cafe sat at the corner of Harbor and Pine, tucked beneath a canopy of crimson maple trees that flamed brightest in late autumn. The white-painted wooden exterior had faded with time, but the round windows shimmered with warm, golden light from within, enough to make any passerby pause for a heartbeat. Imani didn't come for the coffee, but for an old promise Caleb had made the night they left the chapel. There's a place underground, where time is forgotten, and the things left unsaid are kept. She hadn't thought he was serious, but that morning, as she stepped through the cafe doors, inhaling the faint scent of burnt coffee laced with cinnamon and nutmeg, she felt something more than just a small-town cafe. The barista was an older man named Rick, his hair silver and hands always gloved in soft cloth. He didn't ask questions, just nodded when Caleb said they needed to go to the basement. A small door behind the bar opened to a narrow hallway, where wooden stairs creaked beneath each step. Caleb held a flashlight, its dim beam cutting across raw brick walls and cobwebs hiding in corners. Caleb said this basement used to be a wine cellar, voice low, as if not to disturb something long asleep. Then, a storage for old books. Now, no one has a reason to come down here anymore. They entered a low-ceilinged room, damp-walled, but strangely clean. Against the far wall stood shelves of old leather-bound notebooks. A piano with a broken leg leaned in the far corner, keys yellowed, but some still capable of sound. Imani approached a small table, where an old typewriter still held a sheet of paper in its carriage. She touched a key gently. The soft clack echoed like a melancholy note in the stillness. "Did you ever write here?" she asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He walked over, pulled a thin notebook from the shelf, flipped it open, and handed it to her. On the page were handwritten lines of poetry, short, abrupt, but honest. I search for dreams at the bottom of a coffee cup, but all I find is someone, still afraid to name. Imani flipped through more pages. Each one held fragmented memories, unfinished stories, one-sided conversations, unsent letters. "Are these yours?" she asked, eyes still on the journal. "Maybe," Caleb replied. "Or perhaps they belong to others who sat here before me. In this place, we don't keep names." Imani closed the notebook and set it gently on the table. Something inside her stirred. A memory from long ago, when she used to write letters to her mother, but never sent them. When she'd wanted to scream out her silent anger but held back, afraid it would make her seem weak. "Do you think the things left unsaid can silence us forever?" Caleb looked at her. "No, they're just waiting for the right person to hear them." An hour later, they sat across each other, each with a cup of hot coffee brought down from the cafe above. Caleb told her about his father, a man who was once a traveling musician, but one day set his instrument down and walked toward the sea, never to return. "He told me," Caleb said, "some sounds only echo in silence, and sometimes silence is the only song we leave behind for others." Imani listened, not interrupting. The story didn't feel foreign. Maybe everyone has had someone who left like that, not out of hatred, but because they had no words to stay. Before leaving the basement, Imani paused beside the typewriter. She removed the old paper and inserted a fresh one. Sitting down, she typed slowly, each key echoing like a distant melody. "If someone finds this line, know that I loved, not loudly, not brightly, but enough to remember for a lifetime." She folded the page, tucked it into a notebook, and placed it on the shelf. Caleb didn't ask what she had written. Maybe because he understood. People write only for themselves in places like this, and unmailed words always find their way back. As they stepped out of the basement, midday light poured through the cafe windows. Rick handed them a slice of pastry without a word. They shared it on the cafe steps. A soft breeze stirred Imani's hair, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer that of strangers, but of two people quietly placing their hands over each other's cracks to keep them from widening. Saltwater Pier at dawn isn't exactly a place for the sentimental. The wind never stops blowing, carrying the scent of sea salt, damp seaweed, and sometimes the distant echo of a ship's horn. Imani came here alone, a thin coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, hands tucked into her pockets, yet still not warm enough. Everything felt cold, the sky, the water, and something inside her that hadn't been named in a long time. When Caleb appeared at the far end of the wooden dock, she wasn't surprised. Perhaps, unconsciously, she had hoped he would come. He wore a dark gray sweater, his hair still wet, as if he had just splashed his face with cold water. He walked to her without hurrying and stood silently for a moment, as if they had already agreed not to speak too soon. "Do you come here often?" Caleb asked, his voice cutting through waves slapping against the boats below. Imani nodded gently. "This place makes you feel like you're dissolving into something bigger than yourself. Sometimes I wish I were part of the sea, nameless, without a reason to exist, just simply a part of the movement." Caleb looked up at the horizon, where the sun slowly pushed through the clouds, sending thin strands of light outward. "I was the opposite. When I was little, I was scared of the ocean. Every time my dad took me to the shore, I'd only go a few steps from the edge. He once said, 'You're only afraid of what you haven't dared to touch.'" Imani smiled faintly. Did you ever touch it? I did, he replied, but not with my feet, with memory. When my dad was gone, the ocean was the only place I thought of whenever I wanted to find him again. They were quiet for a long while. A seagull dipped low near the water and soared upward again, its white wings slashing the pale purple sky like thin scars of memory. Imani exhaled, her eyes fixed on the sea. I never thought I'd tell anyone this, but my mom once disappeared for 3 days when I was 10. No one knew where she went. She left just one letter, no explanation or promise to return. I thought she never would. Caleb turned to her, the morning light casting a soft glow on her cheek, making her expression seem distant, like a blurred painting. Did she come back? Imani nodded. She did. On the morning of the 4th day, she returned with wild roses and never spoke of it again. Since then, I've learned that some absences carry too much to put into words. Caleb grew pensive. But that absence, did it make you stop loving her? Imani shook her head. Softly, Caleb said, I couldn't stop loving you either, even when I thought I should. That sentence fell into the space between the wind and the waves, like a pebble dropped into a still lake. Not loud, but rippling outward endlessly. Imani turned to him, her gaze meeting his, not hurried, not avoiding. Do you love me? Or just the feeling of being able to read me like a sad piece of music? Both, Caleb whispered. And I love the silence between the notes too, the place where you keep what you haven't dared to say. They sat together on an old wooden bench at the end of the pier, its paint peeling and tangled with creeping vines. The space around them felt like a soft shell, allowing them to sit quietly without guarding themselves. Caleb opened the leather bag he'd brought, pulling out an old book, its cover wrinkled as if it had once been caught in the rain. He handed it to Imani. This used to belong to my mother. She kept it between the spice jars and the tea tins in the kitchen. There's a passage in it that I think might speak to us. Imani took it, opened to a page, and read slowly. Love doesn't always have to make everything bright. Sometimes, it's just the small lamp we place beside each other when we sit together in the dark. She closed the book, eyes glistening, but no tears falling. I've gotten used to the dark, Caleb, but no one's ever sat with me in it this long. Caleb gently squeezed her hand. His hand wasn't cold, nor did it tremble. It was simply there, a presence needing no proof, no demands. At last, the sun fully emerged, casting golden light across the shimmering silver surface of the water. Fishing boats began to return, bringing with them the sound of life. But amid the people slowly arriving at the dock, amid the rhythm of a day beginning, the two of them remained quiet, yet close enough to know the other's heart was no longer alone. Imani's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a red brick building, quietly nestled in the old quarter of Charleston. It wasn't flashy, but the slanting afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, carrying the scent of aged wood and the soft sound of pages turning, light as a breath. A place private enough for unhealed wounds and just spacious enough to leave room for memories to seep in. That afternoon, Caleb arrived unannounced. The door opened after 2 soft knocks. Imani was standing by the bookshelf, wearing a long sweater that grazed her knees, still holding a dark leather notebook. Her gaze lifted, not surprised, not evasive, as if Caleb's presence had already been foreseen. "Can I come in?" he asked, but stepped in before she could answer. Imani smiled faintly. "You always do that." Caleb didn't reply. He just sank into the armchair by the window, eyes scanning the overflowing shelves. Classic novels, poetry books, a few dusty journals, and black and white photos framed in thin wood. His eyes landed on a small silver tin box in the center of the shelf. Was that your mother's? He asked. Imani nodded, placed the notebook down, and pulled the box from the shelf. Inside was a yellowed letter, among the scent of old paper and fading ink. I found this letter 2 weeks ago, she said, her voice low like distant background music, tucked inside a book on existential philosophy. No one ever told me it existed. Caleb reached out, accepting the letter. The handwriting leaned slightly, delicate, written in pale blue ink. The script bore the elegance of someone who had written often and loved deeply. My dearest Imani, I may have left you once again, if you're reading these words. Not because you weren't enough, but because I always felt like a stray flicker in your life, not worthy of staying too long. Caleb paused, eyes lingering on the broken sentence. Imani looked out the window, where the sunset painted rooftops with a soft orange hue. She wrote the letter, but never sent it. She said, maybe she was afraid, or maybe she wanted me to find it at the right moment. Caleb continued reading. There are wounds, my daughter, that we cannot share with anyone, not even those we love most. But that doesn't mean love doesn't exist. It only means it stays silent, like a lake after the rain. He folded the letter, handing it back to her gently. She loved you more than you thought, he said. Imani nodded, but her eyes were empty. I know, but that doesn't make me feel any less left behind. Caleb remained silent. No words could fill the void left by a mother who couldn't stay, and a child who had grown up in the shadow of a nameless absence. He stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out one of the yellowed volumes. I like this place, he said, his voice soft, as if trying to shift the moment without breaking the connection. It's like you, quiet, but never empty. Imani's lips curled slightly. And who are you in this place? Caleb set the book down, tilting his head in thought. Maybe a passerby who wandered into a library on a rainy day, didn't plan to stay long, but then got pulled in, unable to look away. The air in the room grew heavy. The silence was no longer a pause, but the echo of unspoken things. Imani, he said, this time without evasion. I don't want to be just a passerby. She turned to him, the soft glow of the yellow lamp brushing her face, the light of a woman who had learned to hide everything behind gentleness. Do you know I'm in love with you? She asked, without adornment. Caleb hesitated briefly, but didn't deny it. I hoped so. Then, do you know I hate falling in love too soon? Because it makes me feel weak. And I hate myself when I feel weak. Love isn't weakness, Imani, Caleb said. Sometimes it's the last bit of strength we have left. They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. There was no cinematic ending with music and fading lights. Just two people standing side by side, surrounded by the scent of old books, the ceiling lamp's glow, and a letter that had never been sent. And in that seemingly ordinary moment, something changed. Not loudly, not grandly, but deeply enough to never be forgotten. Charleston welcomed the early spring rains with lingering humidity, and clouds hanging so low they seemed within reach. The oak canopies draped their shadows over the red brick-paved street, where every step echoed with a familiar crunch. And on that street, Caleb stood waiting outside Imani's small cafe, a place tied to more things than he could name. He was late. Later than a decision, later than an explanation. The glass door swung open, and the bell jingled, signaling his arrival. Imani looked up from the counter, her hands still smudged with chocolate mousse. Her eyes met his, not cold, not angry, just a silence that made his heart feel heavy. I thought you weren't coming today, she said, her voice calm, as if reading the daily menu. I needed more time to think, Caleb replied, hesitant about everything. I know. Imani turned away, placed an espresso cup on a tray, and wiped her hands with a worn silk towel. But everything doesn't wait. He stepped closer to the counter, trying to find the right words among the hundreds that had replayed in his mind. But before he could speak, she gently cut in. You don't need to explain if what you're about to say is, I'm not sure. I'm grown enough to understand that when someone hesitates, it means they don't love enough. Caleb shivered slightly. She didn't blame him, but that lack of blame cut like a knife. It made him realize that sometimes it isn't anger, but calmness that reveals the deepest wounds. It's not that I don't love you, Imani, he said softly. It's just, I'm scared. I'm afraid that if I step in, I'll leave like everyone else in your life. She looked at him for a long time. In her eyes was an ocean that had learned many times how to reclaim peace after storms. The issue isn't that you might leave, she answered. If you already know, you might. Stepping in from the start is already a form of cruelty. That sentence left him speechless. Imani didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, but every word and pause was like a needle threading the truth, delicate, yet uncompromising. He sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, the rain had started to fall in soft, drawn-out drops, tracing slow lines on the glass like the hesitant strokes of a painter. Have you ever wondered, he asked after a long silence, if we were the right people at the wrong time? I used to believe that, Imani said, until I realized that if the timing is always wrong, the person may never be right. Caleb lowered his head. For the first time, he didn't feel like the one who had been hurt, but like someone passing through a heart brave enough to love and courageous enough to let go. She continued, I don't need you to choose me out of guilt, and I don't want to be the anchor that keeps you here when you're not ready. He looked up. Her lips were pressed into a soft line, as if she had finally said something she'd wrestled with for many nights. But if you're ready, her voice was like smoke. Then come back with a whole heart. Not with a what if, not with a maybe. Imani stepped behind the counter and poured him a cup of black tea. The rising steam blurred the space between them, a place once familiar now drifting between two uncertain shores, between holding on and letting go. He took the cup, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. The touch was barely there, but it cut like a scratch in his heart, a place he could no longer deny. He loved her, and what he feared most wasn't stepping in anymore, but losing something he should have held on to. But he knew, love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. And sometimes, being the right person isn't enough if you love in the wrong way. The rain grew heavier, like the weary sigh of a tired city. Caleb stood up and placed the now cooled cup on the table. He didn't make any promises, didn't plead, just left behind a deep and sorrowful gaze, like a pause hanging in the middle of an unfinished song. Imani stood still, quiet, as if she had seen this moment coming all along, because she knew that sometimes love is about understanding, learning, and letting someone go if they haven't truly chosen to stay. At the end of spring, Charleston was a strange blend of things not yet faded and just beginning to bloom. The scent of jasmine from someone's backyard drifted into a narrow street, lingering in the damp air after rain. Willow branches along the riverbank began to droop toward the water, as if leaning into an unnamed memory. Imani strolled across the wooden bridge leading to the harbor. The tips of her canvas shoes were soaked, leaving blurred stains on the planks. She still held a cup of hot coffee, its warmth pressing into her palm, but doing nothing to chase away the emptiness spreading in her chest. Caleb had left, not with a formal goodbye or a vague promise. He stopped showing up. She still opened the cafe every morning and arranged the tables as if he would come, sitting in the familiar left corner, stirring his coffee with eyes that never strayed from her for a moment. But each passing day, the space where he once sat remained empty, silent, persistent, and showing no sign of ever being filled. Imani didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because tears now felt like a luxury she had already exhausted on past goodbyes. She once hoped, once allowed herself to believe this time would be different. That love might not be perfect, but at least it would stay. Sitting on the old wooden bench by the dock, she gazed at the gently rippling water. The soft waves nudged one another, like they whispered something only the sea could understand. She brought the cup to her lips, bitter and warm, like the aftertaste of a relationship now gone. Perhaps everyone has that one love that makes them quieter, deeper, but no longer expectant. In her mind echoed the voice of her mother, the first black woman who taught her how to love herself, how not to lose who she was to hold on to someone else. Don't love with trembling hands, baby. If they won't hold them, you learn to let go gently. As a child, she used to think her mother was so stern, but now, Imani understood. It was how a woman had to learn to survive, not in this world, but in her own heart. Evening crept in. The sky was tinted purple-gray, as if dyed by faded memories. Imani pulled an old camera from her coat pocket. It was a gift she'd bought herself on her 30th birthday, when she decided to preserve moments belonging to herself. She took a photo of the water, just as the sunset broke across it, scattering into thousands of gentle amber shards. A moment so peaceful, it made her heart slow, and she finally breathed evenly again. Across the bridge, children's laughter rang out, followed by the patter of feet chasing one another. Life continued. People came, people left, people stayed. And perhaps not everyone who stays loves you most, but surely they're brave enough to face your brokenness without turning away. That night, Imani returned to her small second-floor apartment overlooking the old town. She pinned the photo she'd just taken to the notice board beside the kitchen. Below it, she wrote, "Today, I'm not waiting for anyone anymore, but I will still love, in a gentler way, and for myself first." The phone rang. It was Zora, her best friend from college, the one who always knew how to pull her out of rainy days inside. "You okay?" Zora's voice crackled through the line like a light beam in the dark. Still breathing, Imani gave a faint smile. Still drinking coffee, writing, watching sunsets. "Then you're doing better than most." They fell silent for a few seconds. Then Zora spoke, very softly. "Caleb called me." Imani's heart sank, but she didn't ask, just sat there, gripping her cup of ginger tea tightly. "He's in Nashville. He's trying to sort things out." Imani nodded, though she knew Zora couldn't see it. "Don't wait, Imani. But if you still love him, then live well, so that if someone ever comes back, they'll know they're returning not just to a person, but to a whole world that grew without needing them." The call ended. Imani turned off the kitchen light and walked into the bedroom. The night breeze slipped through the door's crack, carrying a soft scent of sea salt. She closed her eyes. There was no more waiting in her heart, only the echo of someone who once arrived, and perhaps would never truly leave. The attic where Imani lived was flooded with morning sunlight. Rays filtered through the thin curtains, falling softly on the blankets, as if someone were gently painting streaks of light across every corner of the room. She sat on the wooden floor, her back against a small bookshelf, next to an old mailbox she had stumbled upon while cleaning the storage last weekend. It was an old wooden box with a rusted lock. Inside were neatly stacked letters, and a few faded photographs, worn by time. All of them were letters from her mother, written to a man Imani had never met, a man absent from her life, without a name, without an address, just a quiet corner in the memory of the woman who had passed. The first letter bore a careful, delicate handwriting, likely written when her mother was still very young. Today, I could hear the sound of my heartbeat clearly, not out of joy or pain, but because I knew I was stepping through something I could never return from. Imani read each line slowly, as if touching the secrets her mother had kept hidden all her life. In those letters lived a deep, quiet, and dignified love. No bitterness, no demands, whispers to herself, as if writing them down was enough. Perhaps her mother had once been like she was now, loving someone silently, then learning how to live with their absence. But unlike Imani, she had never spoken of it. As Imani set the letter down, she suddenly realized the silences her mother had carried throughout their time together. Those quiet afternoons when her mother sat by the window, embroidering dresses, her gaze lost somewhere far away. Those long nights with nothing but the clock ticking, her mother still awake, eyes staring into nothing. Imani had never asked, maybe because she believed mothers weren't allowed to be fragile. But now, through every word, every sentence, a different portrait was forming. Not the strong woman she had always admired, but a young girl who had once loved, once waited, and had once quietly endured. She sat there for a long time. The sounds of the city outside the window seemed to sink into a thin layer of fog. In her mind was an image of Caleb, not clear, but haunting. His eyes, the last time they met at that cafe, the gentle, hesitant squeeze of his hand, as if he wanted to say something, but pulled back into silence. Imani had never blamed him. She didn't understand, and it was because she didn't understand that she remained stuck between two emotions. On one side, her mind whispering that everything should end. On the other, her heart refusing to let go entirely. That afternoon, she went to the photo gallery, where she had a small corner displaying her landscape photography. On the wall hung a new photo, a still lake wrapped in mist, the horizon nearly melting into the pale gray sky. She titled the photo, "Walking Memory." A man stood before the photo for a long while. It was Miles, an older photographer she had collaborated with for several exhibitions. He turned to her, squinting as though digging up a piece of his memory. "Are you learning to let memories walk?" he asked, half joking. Imani nodded. "There are things," he said, "that can't be held on to. Not because we didn't love enough, but because memories need a place to rest, too." She looked at him, her eyes suddenly rippling. "I'm just afraid that if the memories leave, I won't have anything to remember him by." Miles smiled, the kind of smile worn by someone who had lived through many seasons of love and parting. "You'll never forget, but it won't hurt anymore. That's when memory doesn't leave. It becomes a part of you." That night, Imani returned home and placed the old mailbox inside a small drawer, next to the photos she had taken and an unused notebook. She opened to the first page and wrote a few lines. "Your daughter understands now, Mom. To love isn't just to hold on. It's to let what's past rest peacefully in your heart." Then she closed the notebook, opened the window, letting the night wind sweep in, carrying away the lingering scent of morning rain. On the table, her phone buzzed softly. A message from an unknown number. "Do you still have the photo we took at the beach?" Her heart froze. Her finger hovered over the screen, not rushing to reply. Outside the window, it began to rain again. Imani didn't reply to that message right away. She let it sit silently in the thread, like a leaf refusing to fall from the branch, suspended between memory and the present. That morning in Brooklyn was unusually gloomy. It didn't rain, but the gray clouds hung like a thin veil draped across the heart. She walked through familiar streets, hands buried deep in the pockets of her trench coat, earphones in, but no music playing. The sounds of the city, the wheels rolling across damp pavement, the honk of a bus, people calling out in the marketplace, all seemed to pass through her without touching her. After reading the message the evening before, Imani opened her phone and searched her photo folder. The picture was taken one summer afternoon last year at Montauk Beach. The sky then was a deep blue, the sand golden like honey, and the smile on Caleb's face lit up the frame more brightly than the sun. Imani hadn't taken the photo of him. She had turned the lens toward the sun, where his silhouette was walking away, holding the straw hat she had forgotten, the wind sweeping across the sky behind him. She saved the picture in a private album, naming it Things That Can't Be Kept. Caleb had once been a patch of light in Imani's life. Not blazing, not dazzling, but warm enough that even a gentle touch made her heart flutter. They had loved each other for a time that wasn't long, but deep enough to make the silence that followed echo with weight. She remembered the first time he touched her hand, in a second-hand bookstore in Carroll Gardens. The touch was light, as if he wasn't sure he had the right. And it was that hesitation that melted Imani's heart. Caleb was always like that, approaching with gentle eyes, speaking more through silence than words, making people feel safe in his ambiguity. But love requires more than gentleness. It needs something clearer, like a promise, or at least a step in the same direction. Imani had once waited for those words, that he would stay, that no matter what, they would move forward together. But instead, Caleb chose to step back, slowly, carefully, without a clear explanation, as if he believed that silence was the best thing he could offer. She didn't cling, didn't get angry. It was just that after he left, the world around her seemed wider, in a lonely, excessive way. That afternoon, Imani stopped by her usual cafe, where she often wrote in her journal or edited photos. The cafe wasn't crowded, and soft jazz floated through the space filled with the warm scents of wood and cinnamon. She opened her laptop, intending to work, but her desktop background was the Montauk photo, and her heart stirred again, not because she was still in love, but because something remained unsaid. A soft chime sounded from the front door. She didn't look up until a blue jacket stopped before her table. "I figured you still liked the seat by the window." Imani looked up. Caleb. His hair was still slightly tousled. His eyes were a smoky gray, and his voice was like an old song she used to know by heart. "You knew I'd be here?" she asked, her voice calmer than she expected. "Not sure, but I guessed, and hoped." He sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. They were silent for a moment. Only the spoon stirring in her coffee cup made a sound. "I got your message," she said softly. "I know, but I also knew you wouldn't reply, because I didn't know what to say." Caleb nodded gently. He didn't smile, nor did he look away from her. There was something different about him. Not the hesitance from years ago, but not quite decisiveness, just a quietness, like someone who had passed through many sleepless nights and learned how not to ask anymore. "How long have you been back in New York?" Imani asked. 2 weeks. Came back from Lisbon. Had some things to deal with at the old gallery." "And me?" She didn't look at him. "Was a part I couldn't stop thinking about." The air thickened. It was as if every word they spoke touched something profound that had long lain dormant. "Did you come here to apologize?" Imani asked, locking eyes with him for the first time. Caleb shook his head. "No, you don't need an apology. But I needed to see you again. Just once. Because I left too quietly." She said nothing. Her heart repeated the words, too quietly like a door closing in winter, without wind, without sound. "Imani," he said, his finger gently brushing the rim of his coffee cup. "I'm not hoping things will return to how they were. I want you to know that I still think about you, in a way that has no name." Outside, the wind blew through the street, the season's first raindrops tapping the window pane, delicate like fingers knocking lightly on the heart. Imani looked out. She didn't know what lay ahead. But in that moment, with the rain falling, and a man who once meant a whole season of longing sitting across from her, every unspoken word quietly rose into the air. Imani sat in the cafe long after Caleb had left. On the table, her latte had gone cold, the milk surface scattered with faded silver swirls. She didn't take another sip, nor did she open her laptop. She just sat there, silently, as if listening to the layers of time folding back into herself. New York, on rainy afternoons, always evoked memories. Not of a specific moment, but of a feeling, of things never quite touched, things that had gone far, but never truly left the heart. Caleb had gone, as lightly as he had come. But unlike before, this time, he left behind a void shaped like an unlocked door. She didn't know whether to step through or close it and walk away forever. The next day, Imani returned to her usual rhythm. Work at the studio was still buried in a flood of autumn wedding photos. She sat for hours before the screen, carefully brightening every gaze, softening every touch. She had always believed in the authenticity of moments shared between people in love, whether in photographs or real life. Lately, however, whenever she edited a photo with two people gazing deeply into each other's eyes, Imani paused longer than usual, because she realized it had been long since anyone had looked at her that way. Not because no one loved her, but because she had built an invisible, transparent wall between herself and the world. A layer of glass that made everything feel safer, but also colder. She had learned to love without asking, give without complaint, and stay silent without suffering. But sometimes, she wondered if that was truly love. One weekend evening, with rain drizzling since the afternoon, Imani walked along Bleecker Street and stopped in front of the old bookstore where she and Caleb had first met. The glass door was fogged with condensation, the warm yellow light inside casting a soft glow onto the tiled doorstep like a memory. She pushed the door open. Caleb wasn't there. Of course not. But all of it remained. The scent of old wood, the whisper of turning pages, and the feeling of once being young. She strolled along the shelves, fingers brushing over the book spines, as if trying to rediscover something long lost. Finally, she stopped at a thin volume with a gray fabric cover. The title, written in handwritten script, "Letters to a City That Forgot Me." Imani smiled. Perhaps New York never truly forgets anyone. It's just too busy to hold on to someone. She brought the book to the counter. The cashier was an older woman, silver hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She smiled when she saw the title. "That's a lovely book. It's about things people never say out loud, but that still stay like a draft never sent." Imani nodded softly. That was precisely it. That night, in her small sixth-floor apartment, with a window overlooking the golden lights lining Lafayette Avenue, Imani wrote to Caleb for the first time. Not to send, to write. Caleb, I don't blame you for leaving quietly, but I still wonder, if I had said, "Don't go," would things have been different? I used to believe love meant keeping each other at peace. So when you chose to step back, I didn't stop you. But gradually, I realized, sometimes peace is just another way of hiding. and hiding is never a complete way to love. I'm not writing to reclaim anything. I want to say, I've forgiven, not you, but of those days gone by, when I didn't dare believe I deserved an evident love. I still live in this city, still walk the streets where your footsteps once echoed, and I no longer avoid them. If one day we meet again by chance, at a subway station or in line at a bookstore, let's smile like two people who were once the gentlest part of each other, even if only for a moment. She placed the letter inside the book, unsealed, undated. She knew it might never be sent. But some things, just by being said, are enough to set you free. A week later, Imani received an email from Damien, the photographer she had collaborated with on a project 2 years ago. His message was brief. I have a special offer for a collaboration. If you're still shooting, meet me at MoMA Cafe, Friday 4 p.m. Imani didn't respond immediately, but something stirred in her heart. Not intense, not eager, just a subtle shift, like a first glance, a first rainfall, an unnamed question. And she knew, this city may never hold on to anyone, but it always sends the right signs, if one is attentive enough to see them. Imani opened her eyes in the half-formed morning. The early spring sunlight of Boston slipped through the slats of the blinds, gentle as a delicate hand resting on her face. She lay still, letting her heartbeat quietly merge with the distant call of birds from the balcony. In that moment, everything felt peaceful, so peaceful, it was almost unreal. Last night, Damien had left her a message after walking her home from his photography exhibition. Thank you for coming. If you're willing, let me show you how beautiful Boston can be when you're ready to see it with your own eyes. A simple message, yet to Imani, it felt like a minor key softly turning in a door long rusted shut. After the reunion with Caleb, she had feared her heart might retreat again, curl inwards, lock itself away under layers of fear and doubt. But it didn't. She was no longer the Imani of 2 years ago, the woman who had let love drown her to the bottom, only to live on like a shadow among old, endless dreams. Damien was nothing like Caleb. He wasn't hurried. He didn't pursue. He allowed the distance between them to adjust gently to the rhythm of her steps. In his eyes, there was no expectation, no regret, only presence, like someone sitting beside a quiet lake, waiting for the swans to appear, if they chose to. That afternoon, she agreed to walk with Damien around the South End, where he had taken his first black and white photographs. Boston, through Damien's eyes, felt different. No longer a city of cold red brick buildings or streets lined with distant, historical facades. Through his lens, it became vibrant, humorous, and at times, tenderly romantic. He stopped before a small cafe, where a cherry blossom tree bloomed brilliantly in the courtyard, and pointed. Do you see that? Sometimes, the most beautiful things bloom exactly when we've stopped expecting anything. Imani followed his gaze, silenced. Maybe she too was in such an unexpected moment. They kept walking, most of the time in silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt comfortable, not awkward. When Damien asked about the works she had left unfinished, Imani only smiled and shook her head, as if still unsure someone could care about the things she had long abandoned. You should write again, Damien said, but not for the public, for yourself. Imani replied, You seem to think I'm someone worth saving, half joking, half guarded. Damien turned to her then, his eyes not smiling, but so deep she had to look away. No, Imani, you're someone worth understanding. In her small apartment, Imani sat by the window that night, holding the fountain pen she had tucked away the year before. A blank stack of paper sat before her. No prompts, no deadlines, no one waiting for a manuscript. Only her tangled thoughts, and a fragile idea slowly growing in her chest. Was she brave enough to write the things she had never dared to say? Could she allow herself to feel happy again? The night wind brushed through the window crack, and in the rustling leaves of Boston, Imani lowered her head and placed the first drop of ink on the page. Imani found the old notebook in a dusty wooden box tucked in the corner of a shelf. It was a damp morning, and Boston seemed to sink into a quiet mist, casting a gray melancholy over everything. She hadn't meant to look for it. It was only while sorting through a mess of books and magazines from years past that her fingers paused on the worn edge of a bluish-gray cover. She recognized her handwriting on the label. Things Unwritten. Years ago, that notebook had been where Imani let fragments of unspoken emotions drift. Thoughts she never dared say aloud, the first drafts of an old dream, to become a storyteller with her heart rather than perfect structure. But life had pushed her behind a desk, with deadlines, clients, and the safety of scripts that bore no wounds. Imani opened the notebook and flipped through the pages. The ink had faded slightly with time, but each word still carried its original emotion. There was a passage she'd written in the winter of that year, the winter she had just broken up with Caleb. I'm unsure if pain ever truly disappears, or if we learn to live with it like an old coat, so well fitted, we no longer notice it. Some days I miss him, not because I still love him, but because I was the most myself when I was with him. She froze. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Damien had never known about this notebook. But if anyone could truly understand the words she had written, it would be him. With Boston soaked in rain that afternoon, Imani went to see Damien, not for any apparent reason. She stood outside his photo studio, a small room with white walls and large glass windows facing the street. Damien was adjusting the lighting for a trial photo display, his wet hair sticking to his forehead, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong wrists. He saw her through the glass and smiled. A gentle smile, as if he had known she would come, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Imani sat quietly in a corner, holding the notebook in her arms. Damien didn't ask anything. He poured her a cup of hot tea and placed it gently in front of her. I used to write a lot. She spoke after a long silence. I figured, Damien replied, his gaze fixed in the distance beyond the window. Some people live their strongest selves through words, especially when silent. She looked at him, her eyes quietly searching. Then she opened the notebook, flipped to a middle page and handed it to him. Damien took it without a word. He read slowly, his eyes gradually sinking into the layers of ink. On that page, Imani had written about a dream, where she stood at a foggy crossroads, unsure whether to turn left or right, and heard a voice call out, "You don't need to find the path. Just know where your heart is." When he looked up, Imani caught something profoundly calm in his eyes. Not pity, not admiration, but something more profound, an empathy that needed no explanation. "Do you think," he said softly, "that some things are real even before they're named?" Imani didn't answer right away, but her hand released the notebook, as if she no longer needed it to hold on to any part of herself. She left the studio at dusk. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting shimmering trails across the street. Damien didn't walk her to the door, but his gaze followed her to the steps. Imani strolled. She knew she was standing at a fragile threshold, between the past and what could be, between safety and the willingness to risk. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. It may be time for the unnamed things to live in the light. Imani sat by the window of the familiar cafe on Charles Street, where she and Damien had once spent long hours talking about light and instrumental music. Today the sky over Boston was overcast, the clouds like a silk ribbon drowned in mist, making hearts soften for no apparent reason. In front of her was a pale brown envelope with a handwritten line, "To Imani, from someone who was once a part of you, Caleb." After nearly 2 years of silence, he had sent her a letter. Not an email, not a message, a handwritten letter, written in the script she once knew by heart, like breathing. Imani didn't rush to open it. She left it between a still hot cappuccino and her slightly trembling palm. She gazed outside. The bare branches seemed to be waiting for a new budding season, as if the entire city held its breath for something unknown. When Damien entered the cafe, the wind followed behind him like a decisive presence. He carried the scent of pine wood and a trace of seasonal chill, calmly pulling out a chair and sitting beside her, as if he had known she would need someone, not to speak, but to be there. Imani didn't hide the envelope. She slid it toward him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "What did he write to you?" Damien asked, his voice low and calm. "I haven't read it," she replied softly. "I don't want to know." Damien nodded. No pressure, no curiosity. "Maybe," he said. "There are things we don't need explained. Just acknowledge that they once existed." Imani let out a faint smile, caught between letting go and holding on. "I used to think letting go was an act. I realize it's sometimes a long, quiet, and deeply personal process." She opened the letter. Her hands no longer trembled. The handwriting appeared clearly, gentle like a belated goodbye. "Imani, I've gone through seasons without you, like one walks through a nameless land. I once thought I could forget and replace you, but no one could ever reach the space you left behind. I'm not writing to ask for another chance. I'm writing to say that I hurt someone who deserved to be cherished. And if you think of me someday, please remember the best things we once had, not what broke apart." When Imani finished reading, she looked up. She didn't cry. She wasn't sad. She just felt something inside her soften, a wound that had stopped bleeding, leaving behind only a faint scar. Damien still sat beside her, holding a cup of mint tea. He didn't ask how she felt, but his eyes were warm enough that she didn't feel alone in the surge of emotion. She said slowly that "I used to think I was the one left behind. But now I know. I was the one who chose to move forward. I just wasn't strong enough then to realize it." Outside the window, rain had begun to fall. The droplets tapped against the glass like an endless instrumental tune. Damien reached out and gently touched the back of her hand, a gesture not too intimate, but enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Imani took the letter, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into the envelope. She didn't plan to keep it long. Some things deserve to be closed with the final kindness they can offer. Have you ever regretted choosing to walk alongside someone still tangled in their past? She suddenly asked. Damien looked at her, eyes unwavering. No, because you never let that past define you. You're just learning to understand yourself all over again. Imani said nothing more, but in how she looked at Damien then, something was slowly shifting, like a door creaking open, like a seed breaking through the soil after a long sleep. She knew that if there were a kind of love worth being named after everything, it would be the kind that didn't arrive like a crashing wave, but like a small light, patient, quiet, and always waiting for her to find herself within its glow. The last winter in Elmridge arrived late. Snow didn't fall much, and the air wasn't too cold either. There were only windless afternoons when the lake surface mirrored the golden hue of the setting sun, and bare trees stood still, waiting for the season to change. Imani returned to the lakeside cabin, where she once came to escape. But this time, she didn't come alone. Damien was in the kitchen, the scent of baked goods faintly mingling with soft jazz, playing from an old radio. He was still a man of simple routines, stirring batter with a wooden spoon, folding cloth napkins neatly, and always setting out 2 cups of tea, even when unsure if she wanted one. Imani approached the window, where a small table sat against the glass. She placed an old notebook on it, the one that had followed her through countless journeys, encounters, and goodbyes. It held diary entries and letters she had written, but never sent, to Caleb, and later, to herself. "I want to burn it," she said, as Damien approached, his eyes settling on the notebook. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice always soft as a breath, but never shallow. "Yes," she nodded. "Keeping those things was a way to remind myself not to forget. But now I understand. Some things, the more you hold on to, the harder it is to move on." Damien said nothing. He quietly brought over a lighter. They stepped out onto the porch together, standing beside a small iron stove. The flame rose from the first page, curling it gently before it faded with a soft crackle. She watched the words disappear, feeling no panic or regret in her heart, only a quiet stillness, like the calm after a passing rain. "I'm not sure the pain is gone," Imani whispered, eyes following the thin stream of smoke, "but I'm ready to live a different version of myself." Damien turned to look at her. In the glow of the setting sun, his eyes shone with a warm, brown, steady, and deep. "And that version," he said, "is the one I want to walk with, through winter or summer alike." They didn't kiss. There were no grand promises. Just 2 people who had once been broken, who had once fallen, now standing side by side in a moment quiet enough to hear the voice of their hearts. Imani knew there would still be rainy days, moments of doubt. But there was one thing she no longer questioned. True love doesn't always come to rescue you. Sometimes, it only needs to show up at the right time, in the right way, and with just enough gentleness to ensure no one forgets who they are. Spring will come just like the most profound truths need time to take root. If you've ever been Imani, broken somewhere between love and choice, then maybe you too are on a journey to rediscover yourself little by little. Love isn't the answer, but it can be the peaceful part of a stormy life. And sometimes, loving differently, softer, more accurate, quieter, is the only way love can last. If you also believe in this quiet yet profound love, share this story with someone who needs a gentle anchor to begin again, in a softer way.